Hey everybody, this is Derek Judd, the Cowboy Criminologist here with Cowboy Criminology. So I'd originally recorded this video yesterday, and it seemed like no matter what I did with the Sandra Doorley case, I didn't like how it turned out. So instead of just sitting there and going through almost an hour's worth of video footage to kind of give you my take about it, and there's been a couple of other developments uh, in the Sandra Doorley story that I kind of want to talk about. But first thing, I want to thank Miss Mac for subscribing to Cowboy Criminology. She commented on the Richard Cottingham serial killer Saturday that I did, and she had a lot of really just fantastic even insight into this case. She obviously seemed to have a great deal of information about it. One of the things that kind of got me with what she said was talking about how his victim pool seemed to be so spread out, and that's always something unique, and it's really difficult when you're first learning about serial killers. Is there's this concept because of I guess you could call it the Ted Bundy effect. And the Ted Bundy effect, another Cowboy Criminologist term, the Ted Bundy effect is that serial killers have a preferred victim type. Well, that's not true of all serial killers. You have your preferential type, and then you have your opportunistic type. And Richard Cottingham was obviously the opportunistic type. But it's weird because even with an opportunistic offender, there's usually some kind of consistency. But in his case, he just seemed to target transients. So I mean, that was a really good catch on her part. And then she talked about how I love this because serial killers are infamous with this. Also, going back to Ted Bundy, when they start to realize that their time is running out, or in Cottingham's case, because he wasn't going to be executed anyway, he had some time to play games, and a lot of times those games involve frivolous lawsuits. Miss Mac talks about his mattress, and I remember something about him filing a lawsuit about his living conditions and everything. And if you look at the crime scene photos that I put up in that video, yeah, I totally agree with you, Miss Mac. I could care less about his personal comfort. But he also has this tendency where every few years he starts becoming more and more forthright, talking about more and more victims. Now, whether he's just confessing, I know he started to get close with the daughter of one of his victims, which is odd. And so maybe he's trying to make amends, or she's having an effect on him that's making him want to help these families get closure. Or maybe he just enjoys the attention. That's where my money is. That's where the smart money is. But so Richard Cottingham actually, well, Richard Cottingham and Ted Bundy inspired an episode of Criminal Minds. I know, shocking, right? But there's an episode where a serial killer that David Rossi put away, played by Joe Mantegna, who does a fantastic job. Every year, they make an agreement. The killer is taken off of death row, and he promises to give the name of one of his victims and a location every year. Two conditions: he'll only tell David Rossi, and he gets to pick the day. And so a day that is normally something of a celebration for most people, he turns it into a dark day. So David Rossi can't even look forward to his birthday because he knows he's going to get a call from this idiot to go get another body, to launch another investigation. And basically this guy has immunity. You know, he can cop to all of these killings. He can get all the credit for it, faces absolutely none of the consequences because, you know, he's facing life in prison anyway. The final thing Miss Mack added about Peter Vronsky getting brushed by the duffel bag, that he felt like it had two like bowling balls in it were actually the heads. Yeah, that's crazy. And I would imagine that Peter Vronsky has told that story tens of thousands of times. And I can just imagine that in telling that story, there's just a look of discomfort that comes over his face because just thinking about, I mean, not really paying any attention to it, just thinking, wow, that guy's a real prick. He bumped into me, didn't say anything. But in hindsight, learning about it and learning what that actually could have been, yeah, that's scary. So, Miss Mack, thank you. Welcome to Cowboy Criminology. Glad to have you. As always, with everybody, if you know somebody who's a true crime junkie, turn them on to my channel. I love when people comment or leave comments and tell me that that they found my channel just on their news feeds and stuff like that, or things that the YouTube algorithm says that they might like, and so that's always a real treat for me. So y'all, I appreciate it. Like I said, we're up to 77 subscribers. We're over 4,000 views, and that's awesome. So we're talking about Sandra Doorley. Now, Sandra Doorley is the Monroe County District Attorney in Monroe County, New York. She made some waves last week when video of her involved in a traffic stop was leaked. Now, how this information was leaked, or if it was, I don't know. What I think happened is because news channels are always monitoring law enforcement frequencies with scanners. They knew that a public official had been stopped, or they knew the address, and of course, familiar with who she is and where she lived. They requested the video, and what a lot of people don't realize is that body camera footage, once it's complete, once the whatever the interaction is has stopped, it becomes discoverable under a Freedom of Information request. And so I think the news got that, and they were the ones who put it out. And I cannot believe I'm saying this, but I actually think if the chain of events followed the way I said it did, or I think it did, I've actually got to give some credit to the media. I think they did a good thing, and here's why. Looking at this traffic stop, y'all, there's nothing extraordinary about it. I have dealt with this a number of times in my professional careers in law enforcement. As a matter of fact, this type of behavior was so rampant with a previous agency that it's actually what spurred my decision to go to law school and practice law, because whenever you have a police department, you would think that it's headed by a chief, and you would think that there is very little oversight of that department. Well, that's what a lot of people would like you to believe. Law enforcement, they have complete autonomy and there's no accountability, and that's just a load of crap. All right. Another lie started by the media. Most police departments are part of other organizations, whether it's a city, county, hospital district, college district, what have you. And everybody associated with that, especially the higher up they get, whether they're a supervisor in another department, a director, city council person, district attorney, what have you, have this idea that the law enforcement agency is there to do their bidding. And that's not the case. The law enforcement agency is there, conveniently enough described right there in that title, law enforcement agency, the agency that enforces laws. I know it's a weird and wild concept, but that is why we're there. Now, dealing with this level of entitlement and everything, it's frustrating, and unfortunately it's all too common. And I'm glad that somebody was finally exposed for it, because over the last 10 years, non-compliance with law enforcement officers on traffic stops and detentions have resulted in a lot of police officer use of force and deadly use of force. And not all of those have been justified. I want to say that right off the top. I've been a use of force instructor, been a supervisor, and so I can look at those videos and I say lawful but awful, meaning it was lawful in the context of the stop. It looks horrible, but the officers didn't do anything wrong. And then sometimes it's just awful, where you look at that and you're like, dude, you are screwed. And there's no saving you. There's no coming back from that. Okay. I watched Sandra Doorley's apology, and it brought some thoughts to mind. One, it's an entirely canned, typical, I'm taking accountability without taking any accountability. I'll reap whatever consequences. I'll take whatever training is mandated for me. Help me be a better person. I've reached out and apologized to the officer involved. Well, I'm sure that apology was heartfelt, because watching her behavior in the traffic stop, she was defiant the entire time. Her body language was always, I'm in charge, you can't touch me. She had the arms folded. She kind of had it wasn't an aggressive stance, so please don't take it that way. I'm not saying she was going to try and fight this officer, which that actually would have been kind of hilarious. I kind of would have liked to see that. It wouldn't have lasted too long. Anyway, but she had a fighter stance, which is one leg forward, feet shoulder width apart, and a rear leg back. It's an actionable stance. But when she has her hip cocked, it's a stance of defiance. It's saying, I'm over you. I'm better than you. You can't do anything to me. I'm going to fight you. You are going to submit to me. And you can tell she has no concept of why she's in trouble. The only time she's ever appalled by anything is the fact that the officers are making a big deal of her violation of the law. Now, I found all the body cam footage, and unfortunately it wasn't released in a really cohesive order, which is part of the reason I didn't like the video I did yesterday. But I will tell you this. I'll just kind of walk you through where the original video started at, and that was when Officer Krista Foley is in her driveway, and that's when the body camera starts. Now, whether the in-car video caught the actual traffic stop, I don't know. That'll actually be something we talk about here in just a second. But so he goes up, he's trying to talk to her, he's telling her to stay in the vehicle. She won't do that. She automatically starts with, I'm the DA, all of this nonsense. And he's like, okay, that's fine. I understand that. But I tried to effect this traffic stop way back here. And she explains to him at that point that she was on the phone with his chief, asking the chief why one of his officers was trying to stop her. Okay? That's a problem. That's not just a problem for Sandra. That's a problem for the chief of police. Okay? So as things roll on, there's another officer who shows up. Obviously, when you have a vehicle that's failing to stop for law enforcement officers are going to be curious about that, and they're going to want to know why this person isn't stopping. The hilarious thing in this video is if you watch the officers, nobody seems to care that she's the DA. In fact, the female officer on scene, she's like, Sandra's like, I'm the DA. And the officer's like, I know. Like, yeah, okay. And so that's absolutely hilarious. Well, a lieutenant shows up on scene a sergeant shows up on scene. But before all that, the DA calls the chief back again, is talking to him, and then hands her cell phone to the officer. And this is where I have a problem with the chief. The chief should not have talked to that officer. The chief and if he said anything, he should have said, do what you got to do. I got your back. Period. And then hung up and immediately began typing up a report about the DA's misconduct. But that didn't happen. The chief tells this officer that he needs to call for a supervisor. Okay? Common YouTube myth. No state has a law. Let me make sure, because I looked that up. Yeah, I couldn't find a single state that had a law that if somebody requested a supervisor on scene, that the officer magically had to back off and call a supervisor. I think that's more of a department policy, but when I was a supervisor, I had business cards, and I gave them to all of my officers. And they're like, why are you giving me your business cards? I said, because if you get involved in an interaction and somebody wants to talk to me, it has all my contact information on there. Which prompted one of my officers to use one of the greatest quotes I've ever heard said about me. He said, well, I'm just going to tell people flat out and honest, if you don't like me, you're not going to like dealing with him. So I kind of enjoyed that. But that's just because I had really good officers working under me, and for the most part, and I had a lot of trust in the majority of my officers. And so I knew if they were taking action, it was within the law, it's within policy. Okay. What people don't understand about complaining about an officer is just like you can appeal a ticket, you have your day in court with an arrest. If you want to file a complaint against an officer, you are starting an official investigation into that officer. And here in the state of Texas, you actually have to fill out a form under penalty of perjury that everything you're saying about this officer is true and correct. Now, the chief I had at the time, he'd always, and I don't know if he was trying to say that like he had our backs or something, but he's like, oh, I field a lot of complaints and take a lot of the heat off of you guys. And I said, we don't need the heat taken off of us. And he's like, well, they're calling in with a complaint. And I was like, complaints are useless. If they're not willing, I said, did you offer them the chance to come in and put that complaint on paper? Yes. Did they? No. You know what that tells me right there? Whatever it was, they're just trying to get that officer in trouble. But as soon as they sign their name to that piece of paper, they're on the hook, and they don't want to be held accountable for that. Okay. So, Yeah, I always had my officers back. Now, the sergeant and lieutenant on scene, they didn't really seem to give Officer Christofoli a lot of support. The sergeant was like, "Yeah, do what you think is right," but didn't say, didn't give any other instruction. Didn't give him, "Hey, you know what? She's in the wrong. This is your job." And part of being a police officer is doing your job when it's difficult. Okay. Now, at one time, I think there were 4 officers on scene, maybe 5. Yeah, I think 5 officers on scene, which was a little excessive. Um, I don't think the supervisors should have been there. And if I have one criticism uh, about the way the traffic stop was handled with the officer, it's just that it went on so long that everything started to circle back to her original argument, which is, "I'm the DA, leave me alone." And that's not necessarily bad. It's an awkward situation, and officers would say, "Well, I'd have pepper sprayed her, I'd have tased her, I'd have just placed her under arrest, what have you." It's not your traffic stop, so you don't really know. And what an awkward position to be in. I don't know how long Officer Christofoli had been with the agency. According to the lieutenant, like of the 3 officers that were there, of the 5 that were there, only 2 of them had been with the department longer than a year, and that was the lieutenant and the sergeant, who knew that this was her house. And so, I don't know if this is just a young officer, or maybe he just started there and didn't have a whole lot of experience with that agency and how they do things, because every agency kind of handles things a little differently. And like a lot of sheriff's departments, sheriff's offices, they don't want their deputies out writing tickets to registered voters. Now, obviously, if somebody's doing something that warrants that behavior, you've got to do that. But as a general rule, just going out and doing traffic enforcement was a lot of sheriffs don't approve of that, because you're messing with votes, and you don't want that to happen. But a lot of good sheriffs, they're not really worried about traffic enforcement unless it's in certain areas where there's a lot of motor vehicle accidents, pedestrian versus vehicle accidents, or things like that. They're more out actually doing enforcement action, setting up stings, going out and really taking care of the bad guy, and keeping crime down. So getting back, Sandra Doorley was originally stopped for doing 55 and a 35, so 20 miles over the speed limit. Now, that number is very important because she narrowly missed another crime. Okay. So I went through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 6 charges that can be filed on her. Okay. There could have been a 7th, but because of the way New York writes their traffic law, it just didn't happen. So, Vehicle and Transportation, Section 1101, required obedience to traffic laws. It is unlawful, and unless otherwise declared in this title with respect to particular offenses, it is a traffic infraction for any person to do any act forbidden or failed to perform any act required by this title. Okay. Basically, that's any traffic violation. That's actually kind of like the wording of that, because that is like the ultimate catch-all. I don't know if y'all know this, but it is actually against the law to operate a motor vehicle in any state in the United States, because if you read the traffic laws, of your state, you will find that law enforcement can pull you over for any of those infractions. And yeah, it can be really difficult, even if you've got a lot of experience with traffic stops. It can be really difficult to find probable cause to stop a suspect vehicle, uh, on a straightaway where they're not making any turns and there's no traffic for them to avoid. So yeah, it's kind of cool, but a lot of people kind of roll their eyes. It's like, oh, this isn't a big deal. It's like, well, the state legislature thinks it is, and that's why I'm able to stop you for it. Okay. Section 1102, obedience to police officers and flag persons. No person. There's nothing in here about being a DA that alleviates this responsibility. No person shall. Now, when you're dealing with statute, when you hear that word shall is definite, and it means that it's not that this should be done, this could be done. It's this will be done in all cases. Shall is one of those words that really make law enforcement officers' ears perk up. They're like, ooh. Shall fail or refuse to comply with any lawful order or direction of any police officer or flag person or other person duly empowered to regulate traffic. Okay, so the lights, the sirens, all of that, prove that statute right there. Now, a lot of the evading in a motor vehicle statutes for different states are written differently. And in Texas, basically all you have to prove is that this individual attempted to evade you, and you can usually say because of a certain distance that passed, or acceleration, however they're doing it. You can usually make a case for evading in a motor vehicle. Now, in New York, there's two things that have to be proven by the prosecution. And the first one is that the individual had to know they were being stopped by the law enforcement officer behind them. Sandra Doorley admitted that multiple times. She just said, I didn't care. I called your chief because I wanted to know why you were stopping me. Even though she admitted that she was doing 55 and a 35, so she already knew. Now, I told you this would come back because the other part of that statute is that the person has to be exceeding the speed limit by 25 miles per hour or more. And she was 20 over the posted speed limit. So I think she knew that, and I think she kept it under that just for that reason, because I don't think she had any intention of complying with Officer Cristofoli in this stop. Okay. Pause for just a second. Actually, no, we'll keep going because this feeds right into what I want to talk about now. I love it when a plan comes together. New York Penal Law 135.65, subsection C, first degree coercion. This is what happens when somebody violates their duty as a public servant. This is a nonviolent felony, no jail, but probation between 1 and 7 years. She absolutely did this because she was using her position to place herself above the law. In doing that, she created this whole mess, and no amount of ethics training is going to fix that. She's a bad actor. If the circumstances were reversed and it was the officer who's been investigated for this kind of conduct, they'd be demanding his badge, his gun. They'd want him out of law enforcement because he can't be trusted. Well, this is an attorney who says multiple times, I know the law better than you, which in some ways she did, because, or used her knowledge of the law, or at least her power, to coerce Officer Cristofoli in not taking more action than what he did. But this is where we feed into official misconduct. Okay? Official misconduct, abusing one's power for personal gain. And this also feeds into preventing a police officer, or I'm sorry, that's obstruction of government administration. She prevented Officer Foley from doing his job, refused to comply with his demands on the traffic stop, talking to his chief. All of those things play into that. So, like I said, there's 6 charges there, and we've gone through 6 of the, or 5 of the 6 of the 7. But the 6th one that we can actually pin on her, she actually could be facing federal charges for abuse of office. Because of that, because she's an elected official and everything, and because she denies or impedes another in exercise or enjoyment of any right, privilege, power, which is what a police officer has, she has abused her office. She's used her position to attempt to get out of a ticket. Now, Chief Dennis Kohlmeyer, why he didn't tell her to pull over, why he wanted to talk to his officer, or why she wanted him to talk to, anyway, it doesn't matter, because nothing should have had to have been said. Law enforcement officers have a lot of discretion to act, should have a lot of discretion to act. And when you have supervisors who are giving minimal feedback, if any, like I said, the only one who gave any feedback was that sergeant. And the sergeant just basically said, hey, do what you think is right. But he didn't sound really confident about it. It wasn't like, hey, do what you got to do. I got you on this. Don't worry about it. Handle it however you want to handle it. And like I said, the traffic stop had kind of, it lasted so long that it turned circular, and I think he should have just, and like I said, not being on scene, not being my stop, outside looking in, I would have told him as a supervisor, hey, the next time you're in that situation, write the ticket and just get out of there. And if you want to file charges later on down the road, file charges later on down the road. You've got the body camera to back up everything you're saying, but that's on you if you're going to file those charges. The lieutenant, he seemed like he wanted to be anywhere but there. But there's already a sergeant there. He didn't need to be there. Now, the chief told Officer Foley that he needed to call a supervisor, and what do you know, 2 supervisors show up. But that shouldn't have happened. It's this officer's traffic stop. He needs to be able to handle it. And if you can't trust an officer to handle a traffic stop by themselves, they really don't have any business being a police officer. Now, Officer Foley, this is not the case with him. I think he was just in a really bad situation and trying to do the absolute best he could under, an extreme situation. And a lot of times in situations like that, officers have to wonder, is this a test? Is this a check of my integrity? And it places the officer in almost a catch-22, where no matter what they do, they're going to feel like they did everything wrong. Now, let me tell you why I think the news did a good thing in exposing this. It forced the chief to have to issue to have to issue a public statement. And in that statement, he talks about how he appreciates his officer's professionalism and he stands behind his officer, one thing or another. But what do you know? He can't conclude on an open investigation. He can't elaborate more on an open investigation. Well, I think the chief needs to be investigated too. He interfered with his officer's ability to perform a job. As the chief law enforcement officer for that agency, he had a responsibility to remind the district attorney of her lawful duty as a citizen to pull over and comply with his officers. And that didn't happen. So we have 1 felony and 5 misdemeanors that she can be charged with. There's absolutely no way she can keep performing her function as a district attorney without and have any credibility. And that's the problem. In law enforcement, once you lose your credibility, you're done. And law enforcement is a very small community. So when people find out that you don't have integrity, or you've turned a blind eye to help other people out, or whatever the case is, it's going to be really hard. This agency, the Webster Police Department, I think they're going to have a tough time, depending on what this investigation pulls out, because of the conduct of the supervisors on scene. Now, the sergeant, I don't think he did anything inherently wrong, but I don't feel like he had enough supervisor experience to really stand behind his officer. The lieutenant and the chief, that almost seems coercive in a way, because now it's like we're taking this stop from you. Well, in doing that, because traffic offenses are an on-view offense that an officer has to witness, neither of these two are present, and neither one of them stood up and said, "Hey, you need to comply. If you want to file a complaint, you know where the office is." And neither one of them did that. So I think the police department is going to face some problems. I wouldn't be surprised if the chief and lieutenant received some kind of formal write-up, counseling, suspension, something, because of the way they handled this or failed to handle it. The district attorney, her canned apology, her defiance, her entitlement. I talked about it in a video about the NYPD changing their uniform policy to retain more officers. And officers aren't looking for uniform perks. They're not looking to show off their tattoos or grow beards out or any of that other nonsense. They're looking for support. The last 10 years have been really hard for law enforcement. Now, some of that distrust and some of that and some of that bad PR is absolutely at the fault of certain law enforcement officers. But where law enforcement agencies are failing their people and failing to retain good people is they're not standing up for their officers in situations just like this. Like I said, there's nothing uncommon about this type of behavior. But a lot of times, even when these cases are referred for prosecution, prosecutor has a lot of discretion in whether to take that case or not. And even if all the elements are met, they may or may not want to prosecute that. And if the chain of command within the police department is weak, they're going to serve up that officer, and they're going to start looking for reasons to get rid of that officer, because, well, now you've threatened the harmony that we have with these other entities. Oversight of law enforcement agencies is not a bad thing in and of itself, but there needs to be limits to the input of that civilians, anyone outside of that law enforcement agency, can put on a law enforcement agency. Because when you take away a law enforcement agency's autonomy, you turn them into mercenaries, where basically they enforce an agenda instead of the law. And in doing that, it's no longer about fair and impartial enforcement of the law. It's okay if this person does it. It's not okay if this person does it. And a lot of law enforcement officers, and I'll count myself in that, have walked away from these agencies because of that, because of weak leadership, because of lack of support, because, somebody's nieces, boyfriends, sisters, cousins, mother-in-law 3 times removed got a speeding ticket, and how dare you not know how important this person was. Y'all, the law applies to everybody. And I'm certainly not going to say I'm a saint and that, I always use my turn signal, or I'm always, I'm 5 under the speed limit. I'm not going to tell you all that. But I will tell you that if I get stopped, I know what I'm doing. I've done enough traffic stops to know that if I get stopped, there's probably something, I probably know what I did. I probably didn't signal. I was probably exceeding the speed limit. And, that's on me. But we live in an age now where accountability is just an absolute mystery. Everybody yells about accountability and transparency when it's convenient for them. When it's not convenient for them, though, then they want to say, well, this is over policing and, this is not that serious. And why are you trying to make a case out of it? Because it's an integrity issue. That's why I'm making a case out of it. Because if I'm willing to show integrity when it's difficult here, even on this little thing, even though it makes people uncomfortable, it shows that I'm doing the job for the right reasons. But when you take that away from officers, they're going to start turning away, and they're going to start, officers with a lot of integrity will just walk away from law enforcement and say, you know what, I don't want to deal with it anymore. But then you're also going to have those officers, good officers, who are caught up in a really unfortunate situation because they have a good schedule, they have good benefits, they're getting paid well, whatever the case may be. They're going to stick it out at that agency, but they know they don't have any support. And if something bad happens and an investigation comes down, people are going to want to know why they stayed with an agency that had integrity problems. Because the people on the periphery are going to be safe, because they're going to look at that chain of command and they're going to go, oh, we had no idea that this person had this type of background. They're going to wash their hands of the whole thing, and they're going to be done. Y'all, nobody likes getting stopped. And I'll let y'all in on a little secret. Law enforcement officers, we don't like doing traffic stops. They're dangerous. They're unpredictable. We're not only having to pay attention to what's going on in the vehicle, but we're having to pay attention to what's happening on the roadside. Most of my traffic stops occurred on a major U.S. highway, and I've I've had to dodge more than one car. I actually had a semi truck pass by me in his mirror, caught the back of my shirt. Put a nasty little burn on my back. But y'all, nobody likes it. So if you think the officer has done something wrong, that's what the appeals process is for. If you were treated unfairly and you think the officer was wrong in the action they took, go ahead and make a formal complaint. But don't say you didn't like the officer's attitude. Don't say the officer was rude. That's subjective, and it's irrelevant. All right. I'm sorry you got your feelings hurt on the side of the road, but like a very good friend of mine always said, my behavior is dictated by your actions. So if you start acting like a turd, I'm going to treat you like a turd. You want to be polite, professional, and courteous? You know what? I'm going to be polite, professional, and courteous right back. So, y'all, that's my take on Sandra Doorley. Please like, subscribe, and share on your favorite social media platforms. And tomorrow, we've got Gary Heidnick coming up on Serial Killer Saturdays. So I hope y'all enjoy that. Y'all take care. Have a wonderful weekend.